Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Just do shout if for whatever reason there's any issues there. There's no sound attached to this video, so don't worry if you're not hearing anything from the video. There's no sound to it. Okay, so as we said, the title of the paper, Soft Borders, Menstrual Tensions, Bodies Kept Out. And we're going to start the paper today with some images from two heavyweight title fights between Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz Jr. And these serve as a really useful entry point to establish the main themes and ideas that we're going to cover today. At its heart, our paper is about matter and about mattering. Our locus is the individuated bodies of professional boxers and the material potentiality of gendered sporting bodies. Specifically, our paper is about flesh as a permeable border and blood as one particular marker of permeability. With this in mind, our paper engages with a detailed discussion of blood, laceration, and menstruation. The video that supports this talk is saturated, no pun intended, with images of cut and bleeding bodies. So this is the first and only warning that we give about the graphic nature of the material you're about to witness, and therefore viewer discretion is advised. Throughout the course of this paper, we draw upon the theoretical work of Jack Halberstam, Julia Kristeva, Linda Need and Loic Roquant in order to present a radical rereading of boxing bodies and the role, function and representation of blood within sport. We frame our analysis around notions of matter, mattering and remattering. Here, matter refers to both the physical, material properties of boxing bodies and the narrative and psychic need to have a publicly recognised identity, to matter. Mattering and remattering refer to the process by which bodies are understood to matter and by which their matter is physically changed through combat. We claim that all bodies have material potentiality, but this potentiality is oftentimes read through dichotic and reductive gendered frames, regardless of the biological sex of the individuated body. The embodied nature of combat means that boxers are engaged in a very visceral process of remattering, their bodies being transformed, disfigured and lacerated before our eyes. This process of remattering disturbs the facade of the hard separation between the exterior and the interior, exposing the permeability of bodies. This process makes the otherwise invisible visible. It is a process that disgusts and as such is a process that has the potential to render the body abject, formless, monstrous and threatening. To rematter is a political act. It suggests the potential for fluidity, softness and for vulnerability, terms that have often carried negative gendered connotations. The gendered readings of matter within boxing require greater critical reflection. We focus on blood because the gendered readings of the potentiality of this material substance make it useful for understanding the limitations of current academic readings. Through a critical rereading of blood, we are able to present a radical rereading of the potential of boxing bodies. In the footage and images that we see now are the juxtaposition of two bodies, the hard, tight, shining musculature of Anthony Joshua and the overweight, soft, sagging flesh of Ruiz. Ruiz's victory in the first fight shook up the world after a variety of reasons, not least because his physicality undermined notions of the ideal boxing body, specifically the ideal masculine physical body. His loss in the second fight seemingly restored order. The softness of Ruiz's physique was troubling for the sporting press, as it suggested an uncontrolled, undisciplined body, a self extending beyond acceptable limits, a self in danger of spinning out. These ideas establish a dichotic notion of the hard and soft borders of human bodies. But as the still images demonstrate, through the droplets of perspiration suspended in time, to the trickle of blood from Ruiz's cut eye, boxing bodies in the ring are permanently at threat of having their permeability exposed. The cut to the eye serves as, quote, a sign of the beginning of the unravelling of the male warrior body ego and its dissolution into soft, formless matter, end quote, according to Linda Need. By exposing the, quote, spongy tissue and flowing blood, the otherwise contained and contoured body, end quote, is opened up, revealing the, quote, soft, feminized man rather than the male body as metal tool, end quote, again from Linda Need. Here, the feminized masculinity that pours forth from the body is read as threatening, precisely because it stands in contrast to the iron-like hardened body of the victorious boxer. Once the imagined fixed entity of the body's surface is permeated by a cut to the boxer's eye, Need asks, quote, can the viewer turn a blind eye to or avoid the visual symbolism of vaginal opening and menstrual bleeding evoked in the image of the cut, end quote. The cut near or above the eye of the boxer is threatening because it risks the risk it poses to the damaged body and because of what it exposes. Academic literature on boxing focuses on the spectacular, observable material properties of boxing, wherein damage and deformity are necessary to enact the sport's promise of transformation. Halberstam subscribes to these readings of boxing, analysing the image of the, quote, battered male body, the bloody hunk of ruined flesh, end quote, in Hollywood portrayals of the sport. Halberstam argues that within these depictions, masculinity is, quote, determined not by how quickly the boxer can knock the other guy out, but by how many punches the boxer can take without going down himself. In these films, boxing is a trial in which the male body withstands physical assault, end quote. Within this reading, Halberstam alludes to the material capacities of the human body in both its ability to administer and absorb damage and assaults, but also to the negative and laborious qualities of combat, where bodies are exhausted and broken down by the resistance they encounter. Halberstam's boxer as bloody hunk of ruined flesh stands in juxtaposition to Nee's victorious boxer, who remains the epitome of the, quote, intact, shining muscle armour of the classical warrior, a hardened surface, a shield without interiority, end quote. These two readings depict the material importance of boxing bodies, specifically the processes by which bodies matter and are mattered. As Lo Kwon observes, boxers' bodies are the template and epicentre of their life, quote, at once the site, the instrument, the object of their daily work, the medium and the outcome of their occupational exertion, end quote. Because the fighter's body is simultaneously the means of their production, the raw material and the somatised product of their past training, boxing bodies are unique in that they are both, quote, the weapon of assault and the target to be destroyed, end quote. What is clear from these readings is the focus on the boxer's ability to both beat their opponent until they are ruined, disfigured and destroyed, while simultaneously demonstrating an ability to absorb damage but remain intact. Need recruits the word pulp to demonstrate that as a verb, it serves as a threat of potential action within boxing, quote, I'm going to beat him to a pulp, end quote. But as a noun, pulp is, quote, hybrid, soft and moist, representing what was once hard and intact, but that which has subsequently been mashed and beaten until it is unrecognisable, end quote. If, as Need asserts, quote, pulp signifies an escalation of the threat of dissolution of the self into formless matter, end quote, then Halberstam, Need and Kwon suggest that the ultimate threat for any boxer is the dissolution of self into something that is not recognisable, contained and stable, something which exists beyond borders and betwixt reductive definitions, something that is fluid. Boxing both promises and is threatened by the remattering of bodies. Remattered bodies are mutated bodies, and as such can be read as monstrous. That which is exposed, mutated, and monstrous is abject, quote, neither subject nor object, but unceasingly returns, disgusts, rejects, fascinates. It is near but not able to be assimilated, end quote. To accept Need's reading of the symbolism of blood within boxing is to accept that through the presentation of the menstruating male, a cut boxer symbolises a gender hybrid self. Here it is the hybridity and fluidity that is threatening, rather than the exposition of an interior femininity.
As a female body performing the manly sport of boxing, Couch was labelled, quote, an animal, a freak, barbaric for women, unquote. Jane Couch was forced to endure a 6-month court case against the British Board of Box Control's restriction of trade. Women, according to the board, are, quote, too fragile to box and they bruise too easily, unquote. The core focus of the board's defence of refusing Couch a boxing licence was Couch's natural, read, soft body. By purportedly putting her body at risk of irreversible damage that is ostensibly greater than any male boxer might face, Couch was heavily criticised by the press and in court for subverting gender norms, for going against nature. The board's concerns regarding Couch's femininity were backed by a medical advisor and legal team who concurred that sanctioning female boxing were far too big a risk to take. Rhetoric of the case was shrouded in pathologising and misogynistic claims about women, driven by patriarchal concerns purporting to protect female bodies. In actuality, the key line of defence against Couch had seemingly far more to do with protecting the traditions and ideological positions of British boxing than it did in demonstrating any conclusive evidence that women's bodies were at greater risk of harm than men's. Boxing, after all, is a sport in which men perform what it means to be a man, whereby the boxing ring becomes a space for, quote, the power of dominant masculinities, unquote, to play out. The speculative medical evidence presented argued that women experience, quote, premenstrual tension, which makes them emotional and more liable and accident prone. They might also be unknowingly in the early stages of pregnancy, and they might be prone to breast cancer due to being punched in the chest repeatedly, unquote. The repetition of the term might here highlights the lack of persuasive force and clarity in the board's arguments against women's boxing. During the trial, the board, its legal team and medical advisors were consistent only in reinforcing the so-called differences between male and female bodies. Differences that reaffirmed women's responsibility for reproduction and cast Couch as reckless, careless, and abnormal for putting her body at risk of injury. As Jennifer Hargreaves explains, quote, although it is now officially acknowledged that no reasons exist why biological differences between the sexes should impose restrictions on women's participation in sports, it is exceptionally difficult to shift institutionalized practices and ideas that have supported them for so many years, unquote. The case of Couch versus the board and the surrounding media discourses highlight the contradictory and double binds that female boxers and women more generally are often caught between. On one hand, Couch's body, her female body, her reproductive organs, her breasts required protecting. And on the other hand, Couch's physicality was repulsive and unnatural. She was monstrous. Couch's body was unruly, according to the board, and the refusal to grant her a boxing license can be read as disciplinary action against Couch's purported defiance. Whether female boxers are forced to forego atypical femininity in order to perform the sport, or they have consciously chosen what Jack Halberstam terms abject gender expressions, neither can escape the formulation of boxing as harmful to female biology. Even now, the fears of undisclosed pregnancies, the risk of damage to women's breasts, and even the concern that women are more predisposed to concussion than men are rooted in boxing rule and regulation. Key to the board's dispute with Couch was the incorrect assumption that all women menstruate, and therefore all women experience PMS and are unpredictable. However, the very fact that the defence ignore how many women do not menstruate, trans or cis, and their choice to focus on PMS, a presumed effect of menstruation rather than menstrual bleeding itself, reinforces just how comfortable men are at making decisions about women's bodies, and yet how uncomfortable they are in talking about the details of female bodies that cannot be contained. Leaky, hairy, overtly fleshy female bodies are considered monstrous, disgusting, and repulsive. Kislin's argument that menstruation is a, quote, problem requiring a solution, unquote, or a hygienic crisis to be cleaned up and hidden, is captured in a blog post on boxing and periods by women-specific boxing brand Unorthodox. Unorthodox took to social media to ask boxers whether they discuss their periods with their coaches, declaring, quote, it's strange how in the bin of a boxing club toilet can be full of bloody tissue from bloody noses and cut bloody lips, but can you ever imagine putting a tampon or a pad into it? Never. They don't even have a sanitary bin, and who knows how they would react, unquote. The image of the blood-stained tissues in the boxing club bin is completely normalised and brought into sharp contrast with the author's description of the female boxer feeling complete relief that she hadn't leaked blood during her workout. Quote, I unconsciously glance at my crotch, at the crotch of my legging, in fear that I may have leaked through the fabric. I exhale in relief. Nothing, unquote. The sight of the bloodied, sweaty boxing bodies and the sound of mucus being pulled from the back of a boxer's throat as he spits into the bucket between rounds might be unpleasant, but these are commonplace in contrast to the concerns about menstrual blood. Concerns that manage to incite feelings of panic and fear in the menstruating body itself. A few weeks ago, Matchroom Boxing's latest female prospect, Terry Harper, was pictured after a routine sparring session. Harper's arm around her opponent and smile across her face, her top and white groin guard were splattered with blood. It's difficult to determine whether the blood was her own or that of her opponent's, but in tracing the visible pattern of blood spray and smudges, one cannot ignore the thin, trickle-like blood stain on Harper's legs that sit right below the hemline of her shorts. It is probable that this blood has come from a bloodied nose or small cut, and that the blood has perhaps leaked or poured near the groin area when the boxers have clinched. But whether this blood is Harper's or whether it was transferred from her opponent during combat, the traces of blood near her hemline are certainly reminiscent of the type of bleeding that the aforementioned female boxers are relieved to have concealed during their training. It would be remiss, then, to disregard the connection between the blood that marks Harper's legs and the similar blood patterns that mark the legs of female athletes free bleeding in order to draw attention to the silencing and disproportionate taxing prices around menstruation. The sight of leaky blood stains on Harper's legs are often taken for granted as remnants of the type of bleeding we're used to witnessing in boxing, ergo they go unquestioned, as do the blood stains on Harper's sparring partner's red shorts. Menstrual blood intensifies feeling of abhorrence because of the danger of this blood spilling out and leaking is also bound up in the additional unease of female bodies taking up too much space and infiltrating male-dominated domains. Nevertheless, blood-marked and bleeding bodies of boxers invite opportunity to subvert the myopic freedom restraint rhetoric that reduces the bodies and narratives of female boxers to either empowered or lacking agency. If our reading of the leaky cut above the eye resists what for Halberstam is the iconic and dominant image of the male boxer, the quote, bloodied hunk of ruined flesh, unquote, then perhaps the sight of the bloodied female athlete offers resistance to the overwhelming paradox of bleeding female bodies as either monstrous in pursuit of masculinity or victim of patriarchal violence. If, as Need suggests, the cut above the boxer's eye is his point of weakness, the Achilles heel that opens up a site for alternative readings of the sport, then the uncontained female body may be the ultimate opposition to boxing's hegemonic fragility. Thank you.
So what we thought we'd do now then, I suppose, is just unpack some of the things in there, I suppose, in relation to the wider project that we've been undertaking. And what we do in the book, I suppose, we take that point from Need about the menstruating male, and we robustly challenge that in the book, because for us, whilst Need, we state in the book, we're not suggesting that Need is kind of putting forward an anti-Semitic case when she starts referring to cut boxers as menstruating boxers. It's very difficult not to, as you start to look into what that might mean, the image of a menstruating male. It's very difficult not to not to want to kind of separate, not to draw allusions to kind of anti-Semitic narratives around menstruating Jewish males, for instance. So we unpack that, and we unpick and we challenge the notion, the notions of essentialism, of this notion that there is a version of masculinity, and within inside there's a version of femininity that men are trying to hide, or men are trying to stop from leaking out, in a similar way that we challenge, as Sarah was doing in her piece, about that notion that somehow women have to be either or. And what we do is we try and tap that into and link that back to the birth of the sport and the narrative myths that support the sport, particularly those of modernity projects and those of development theory that have very, problematic, racist and, colonial focused narratives of what bodies should and shouldn't do, and what particular bodies do and don't hold value, and what the aesthetic principles or the expectations of those bodies should be. And I suppose that was the bit that we weren't able to really kind of unpack in great detail in paper, but something I thought would be useful for us to maybe discuss or unpack a little bit now.
I think as well, the I don't know if, obviously, because the abstract, I don't know if it said, but the case against Couch obviously was 1998, and I think it's quite interesting that since the rise now of women's boxing, and when I say the rise, I mean the way Sky Sports has kind of created this narrative around actually what they see as very sweet and well-behaved female bodies, typically white, that image of women's boxing now has kind of recruited this narrative of Jane Couch as the original pioneer, whereas her subject position in the 90s and up until maybe even 2 years ago was never narrated in that way. She was a forgotten part of history. So now I think in order to be future orientated, one of the things that we talk a lot about in the book is the way that these histories of boxing are brought back, and they're recruited, these ghosts of boxing, if you like, are brought back from the dead almost to serve another purpose. So there's not just the very real elements of bleeding bodies, sweaty bodies, very alive bodies in front of us. It's brought into real contrast with the dead bodies, if you like, or the ghosts of bodies that are now all of a sudden being revived, I think. So just to give some context, yeah, it was 1998 that case happened with Jane Couch.
And I think one of the things that we weren't able really to unpack in the book, and we said that we've not really reached a position on it, but I think that our combined interest at the moment and where we're hoping to go with our part of our next piece of work, it is around the movement of blood. And so in the book we use the example, we saw images of it, some of the still images of Tyson Fury against Otto Wallin, where he had a very grotesque cut above his eye, but there's images where Tyson's a lot taller than his opponent Otto Wallin, and there's images where Tyson's blood is kind of splattered over Otto Wallin's back in a way that almost looks as though they're kind of markings of flagellation. So we link it to kind of images of the Passion of the Christ and things like that, about how it ties into these narratives about salvation, legacy, and again about, you know, sacrifice and qualities, you know, aspects of existence that fluctuate between being alive, being dead, being human, being not human, and that movement of blood as a substance of connecting people is where we're interested. So when we're talking about fluidity, in part we're talking about, more so than talking about gender fluidity, we're talking more about the fluidity of physical matter, the physical form that sits maybe outside of kind of essentialist readings of gender and biology.